First, let me introduce our first speaker, Jenyth Evans. Jenyth has completed her BA and MSc at Jesus College and is currently studying for her DPhil in English at St. Edmund Hall. She investigates pseudo-histories in medieval Ireland and Wales and how their cultural authority was co-opted and transformed into the early modern period. Her focus is specifically on Geoffrey of Monmouth's De Gestis Britonum, on the deeds of the Britons, and on the book of the takings of Ireland. She is supervised by Dr. Mark Williams. And the title of her presentation today is King Arthur Tudor, Adapting and Co-opting Geoffrey of Monmouth in Wales and England. Jenyth, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Dirk. I'll just try and share my presentation again. There we go. And then, is that showing correctly on the Zoom screen?
Yes, it is.
Perfect. Thank you very much. All right, so I'll just begin. So thank you very much for that, Dirk. And also, thank you so much to Alexandra and Andrew for their talks this morning. They were both really, really fascinating. So it was really great to hear from you both. But yes, so whenever we talk about King Arthur today, our minds may not immediately jump to Wales and Welsh history. So in my own ignorance, before I started my master's course last year and my DPhil this year, whenever I thought of Arthur, I personally thought mostly of the BBC TV series Merlin. But most people are familiar with the book The Once and Future King, or perhaps Thomas Mallory's Mort d'Arthur. But perhaps, as some of you already know, and there was lots of learned questions in the earlier session today, so maybe this is old hat to all you guys, but the story of King Arthur actually originated from Welsh sources. Arthur is mentioned very briefly in some of the oldest surviving Welsh literature. Like the poetry of Taliesin or Aneurin. But he's a much more substantial figure in the Latin text called the Historia Britonum, which was produced in the court of the Kingdom of Jenyth around the year 828 AD. So in this text, Arthur is recorded as a leader of the Britons who defeated a Saxon army at the Battle of Badon, which was perhaps fought in the early 6th century AD. And King Arthur, as many, if you're Welsh, you probably know it, is featured in the 4th tale of the Welsh tales, the Mabinogion. However, I'm not so interested today in talking about the so-called historical Arthur. Rather, I want to trace the story of how this historically shady king of the Britons was totally transformed into a mythical king of Britain. More importantly, I want to ask how and why a story which was essentially part of ancient Welsh folklore became so important to the Tudor dynasty ascending to the English throne and to Elizabeth I herself. So the first part of the answer to this question, as you may have guessed from the title of this talk, lies in one man's successful translation and adaptation of Arthurian material, Geoffrey of Monmouth. We know surprisingly little about his family origins and his life. He lived around the first half of the 12th century, and he came from Monmouth, which is obviously bordering between England and Wales as a county that borders there. This probably means that he wasn't actually a native Welshman, but he was instead a member of an Anglo-Norman elite. These were essentially men who were planted along the border by kings after the Battle of Hastings, so William the Conqueror or Henry I, so that they were on hand to help suppress potential Welsh rebellions across the border. So members of this elite living in this area would become known as Lords of the Welsh March. So we think Geoffrey was a member of this group because he had excellent Latin, and therefore must have had a top-class education for the time. Later in life, he then was probably a canon at the Church of St. George in Oxford. So as Andrew mentioned in the first session, we know that he worked and lived in Oxford for a while. And then he became Bishop of St. Asaph in North Wales. So in other words, he was well connected enough to move in these kind of elite ecclesiastical social circles. However, the rest of his life is a total mystery. Yet he wrote one of the most popular works in Latin to ever be produced in the Latin-speaking West, the De Gestis Britonum, which translated means On the Deeds of the Britons, but it's also known as the Historia Regum Britanniae, the History of the Kings of Britain. So to keep things simple and distinguish it from the Historia Britonum I mentioned earlier, I'll just refer to Geoffrey's work as the De Gestis Britonum or the De Gestis for the rest of this talk. So the De Gestis claims to be a history of the ancient kings of Britain, and it begins with the illustrious story of Troy. It opens with Aeneas fleeing the burning city, and Aeneas, of course, is the protagonist of Virgil's Aeneid, the legendary founder of Rome. And then it follows Aeneas's grandson, Brutus, who travels to Britain and becomes its first king. It goes on to trace each king or queen's reign of Britain in succession. There's a few queens who reign as solo monarchs in the story, which is quite cool, until the Saxon invasions of Britain. So King Arthur manages to beat back these Saxon invasions during his reign, but after he dies, or more accurately, is taken to the island of Avalon after being mortally wounded, and he never returns, the Saxons overrun the island. And the text ends with the last king of the Britons, Cadwaladrus, dying in Rome after sending his sons to Brittany in the year 689 AD. So this endpoint in particular is highly suspicious. It's very conveniently around the same point when other historical works available to Geoffrey, like that of Bede or the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, start their own records. And on a different side note, the king Cadwaladrus, who's the last king in the text, is the namesake of the Jesus College Book Club Alumni Society, the Cadwaladr Club. So it's a nice connection point there. But yes, so Geoffrey claims the De Gestis wasn't an original work of his own, but that he merely translated it from a most ancient book in the British language. So that is to say Welsh. Regardless, modern scholars are now certain that this ancient book was actually a total fabrication. In truth, Geoffrey made up basically everything in the De Gestis. In order to give it a veneer of validity, however, Geoffrey drew some names from Welsh sources, so like King Arthur, and also Merlin, who's synonymous with the Welsh prophetic figure Mervyn. So Mervyn appears in works such as the conversation between Mervyn and Taliesin. I thought I put it on the presentation, but I didn't. But that's a 11th century text. So yes, so this isn't to say that other people, especially historians, didn't notice that Geoffrey was basically lying through his teeth when he was writing this work. For example, a 12th century author called William of Newburgh, who lived in the North Yorkshire coast, had this to say about Geoffrey's work. So since these events accord with the historical truth as expounded by the Venerable Bede, so these are the parts of the history William has just talked about which he thinks are true because Geoffrey has taken them from Bede, but then he goes on to say about everything else. It is clear that Geoffrey's entire narration about Arthur, his successors, and his predecessors after Vortigern was invented partly by himself and partly by others. The motive was either uncontrolled passion for lying, or secondly, a desire to please the Britons, so that's the Welsh, most of whom are considered to be so barbaric that they are said to be still awaiting the future coming of Arthur, being unwilling to entertain the fact of his death. So this is just one small quote. William of Newburgh rants for many pages about how inaccurate and how bad Geoffrey is. So it was really difficult to just pick one thing out for this presentation. But yeah, William really resents how popular Geoffrey of Monmouth became. So despite this, there were apparently far more people who enjoyed the De Gestis than there were hateful William of Newburghs. What helped him become so popular and what was so important for the co-opting of the Arthurian story in the early modern period was the fact that he wrote in Latin. The material I mentioned briefly at the beginning, the poetry of Taliesin, Aneurin's E Godolphin, as well as the fourth tale of the Mabinogion, these were all written in Welsh. The Historia Britonum was an exception and was written in Latin, and was also the first text which introduced Brutus, that's the grandson of Aeneas, as the eponymous ancestor of the Britons, as well as mentioning Arthur. But of course, the overwhelming popularity of the De Gestis compared with the Historia Britonum meant it was far more readily available as a copy after the 12th century. So this was mainly because Geoffrey had access to important ears in the royal court at this time, and therefore a direct route into the wider Latin-speaking world. The man he dedicated his work to, Robert, Earl of Gloucester, was the illegitimate son of the recently deceased King Henry I, and he was supporting Empress Matilda in the civil war against King Stephen, so a very important figure at that time. Modern scholars have also shown that Robert was instrumental in disseminating the De Gestis on the European continent, and therefore boosted its overall popularity in a really significant way. Geoffrey also wrote in a fashionable mode for the time. The De Gestis was written in the monumental style, like that of other popular Anglo-Norman historians like Odoric Vitalis and William of Poitiers. So he knew his audience and knew the kind of thing that they would expect and want to listen to or read. And Geoffrey also laced his work with classical and biblical allusions. So for example, by beginning his history at Troy, which were very popular motifs at the time. Finally, the alluring claim to have discovered the ancient history of the British past must have made it absolutely tantalizing to those living in England and Wales, as well as an object of curiosity to wider readers. For centuries before this, countries had been tracing their origins back to Troy or to major biblical figures, or synchronizing events in their history with important world events. So, for example, the Franks in the Carolingian era, so that's a couple of centuries before this, and they lived in sort of the area which is modern day Germany now. They produced texts which claimed their origins back to Troy, as did many Italian writers did via the Aeneid itself. So for a long time, Britain had lacked a comparable history until the Historia Britonum came up with Brutus. But it was Geoffrey who was able to spread that story to a huge audience and therefore gain most of the credit for it. So this popularity is evident not least because the De Gestis has survived in more manuscripts than any other secular text, I believe, in the medieval Latin West. It's incredibly popular. In the centuries between Geoffrey's lifetime and the Tudor dynasty coming to power, Geoffrey's original work was read and recopied extensively. But vernacular translations, so that is translations into languages other than Latin, helped it stay relevant across these generations. So there are countless numbers of different translations, adaptations, and spin-offs of Arthurian material that we could trace back to being influenced by Geoffrey, which I could mention here. However, to keep things brief, I'll focus on the collection of Arthurian stories written in French called the Lancelot Grail Cycle, or also the Vulgate Cycle. There we go. So by the time this collection was written, in the early 13th century, lots more material had grown around the original kernel of the De Gestis. So it was in these offshoots, for example, that the story of the Holy Grail started to emerge, which was never originally a part of Geoffrey's work. One slightly later romance you might have heard of as an example is Gawain and the Green Knight, which is from the 14th century. And it's just about to be adapted into a feature film. I think it's coming out this summer, starring Dev Patel, so keep an eye out for that. But the Vulgate cycle was different from romances like Gawain because it was written in prose. So historiographically speaking, this gave it slightly more authority compared with the broadly speaking, more fantastical verse form. And moreover, the Vulgate cycle's narrative sticks very closely to that followed in the De Gestis. So demonstrating again, Geoffrey's text was seen as a prime model to fall back on. It hadn't really been superseded in that century after it. But even as the De Gestis' story blossomed into French prose, the connection to Wales persisted. So modern scholars know today that the authorship of the Vulgate cycle is impossible to figure out for certain. We just don't know who wrote it or whether it was a series of authors. But in the 13th century, so just after it was written, it was often attributed to a man named Walter Map. While Walter Map didn't actually write these stories, he did write a different text called the De Nugis Curialium, so that means on the trifles of the courtiers, which was a series of anecdotes and stories about life in the court of King Henry II. So in it, he tells a story of the legendary King Hurla, which is otherwise known as the Wild Hunt, which you might have heard of. Walter tells us that King Hurla was an ancient king of the Britons, so the Welsh, who was tricked into being transported into the future along with his hunting party. And I think it's by a small dwarven king, and there's all sorts of adventures they get up to at different wedding feasts and stuff. It's a really weird story. But anyway, so King Hurla and his court were then cursed to never be allowed to dismount their horses after they'd been transported 200 years into the future. And therefore they haunted the Welsh countryside, damned to stay in their steeds until Henry II was crowned. So the joke was that Henry's court roamed around so much, they essentially replaced this never-stopping ghostly retinue. So much like Geoffrey of Monmouth, in the De Nugis, Walter claims to have lived in the Welsh marches, and that this story, the story of King Hurla, was Welsh in its origin. However, most modern scholars think the story is not actually from Wales at all, but rather it originated from somewhere on the European continent. So in short, Walter simply made up that he heard it in Wales. But why would he do something like this? Firstly, it shows that Walter thought it was really important to at least claim that he had authority to tell this story, and that he did it by referring to his Welsh or Marcher heritage. Presumably on a basic level, this made chasing up his sources more difficult for the courtly audience in England. But most importantly for our purposes, this implies that Geoffrey kick-started a trend where a writer would claim to be bringing an obscure story from the depths of Wales about ancient Britain to a courtly audience. In modern scholarship, this trend is most often referred to as the matter of Britain. So it's kind of a common trope to talk about the ancient British past or stories from ancient Britain. So this is why Walter's name was almost paradoxically attached to the Vulgate cycle, since he presented himself as an authority in such tales. So overall, this makes it clear that medieval, and as we shall see, early modern readers knew that the story of Arthur came from Wales, and that this was an important part of its afterlife up to the early modern period. Geoffrey's work in Latin hadn't elided this past. But accuracy to original source material, which we might prioritize as modern readers, wasn't really important at all. Simply the idea of authority, which came from claiming the story was Welsh or even more broadly Celtic in its origin, was far more desirable. So speaking of which, I've mainly focused on the outward English continental reception of the De Gestis. However, the text was also extremely popular in Wales itself, and it was translated into Welsh very soon after its original Latin circulation. In fact, the Welsh word for a chronicle or annal, Brit, actually derives directly from Geoffrey of Monmouth's work. It was taken from Brutus, who was the first king of Britain, according to Geoffrey, as you remember, and thus often appeared at the front of chronicles or historical works. Therefore, the Welsh title of the De Gestis is called Briti Brenhinedd, or the History of Kings. The Briti Brenhinedd became incredibly popular, and a sort of sequel work or continuation of it, called the Briti Tywysogion, so that's the history of the princes, soon emerged, which was variously updated by different scribes to record the history of the princes of Wales up to their own lifetime. So that was kind of standard chronicling practice for scribes to update works up to their own period. And actually, given the talk this morning and all the series of talks going on, there's a copy of the Briti Brenhinedd in the Red Book of Hergest, which is in Jesus College's own collections. So you can see the beginning of it here, the beginning folio of it. And what's more, which is really funny whenever I was looking it up for this presentation, the cataloger, the summary cataloger for this manuscript was actually fooled by Geoffrey himself. He's writing about 1852, and he still believes that, yes, this is, of course, this is a direct translation of a book written in Old British or Britannic, and modernized by Walter, Archdeacon of Oxford. So Walter is the person that Geoffrey claims gave him this ancient book in the British language. But yeah, it just goes to show how powerful this story was and how long it sort of stayed in currency, which is really funny. But yes, so from this Welsh reception, and given how it was accepted in both England and Wales very strongly, the most important thing to keep in mind is that Geoffrey wasn't just popular as a Celtic curiosity outside of Wales. His work was fully accepted and integrated into Welsh literary culture very soon after it was published, or circulated more accurately. So the De Gestis became a mutually understandable cultural language across England and Wales, which made it very important for the Tudor dynasty's co-opting of its stories. So alongside all these translations and adaptations of the De Gestis, there was another important genre of literature affected by Geoffrey's work. So in the middle of the De Gestis, the sorcerer Merlin breaks into pages upon pages of obscure prophecies, which he delivered to Arthur's predecessor, the usurper king Vortigern. So these prophecies seem to predict that the Britons would eventually be defeated by an invading Saxon force. However, one day a new leader would allow them to rise again to reclaim their rightful throne. So this is a clear reference to an important figure in the Welsh genre of prophetic poetry, the Mab Darogan, or the son of prophecy. Although Geoffrey was just co-opting a commonplace figure for his own purposes, the popularity of the De Gestis ended up doubling the popularity of this figure, and helped it become known as a stereotyped Welsh trope outside of Wales. And just as a side note, prophetic poetry is often associated very closely with Wales and Welsh literature as well, but it's important to kind of note that there was a lot of English political prophecy going on, especially in the Tudor period as well. So it's not just a Welsh stereotype. This was happening on both sides of the border. But it ended up becoming a stereotype because of the De Gestis in a way. So if we think back to that William of Newburgh quote again, I'll just bring it up. We can see how it's becoming part of this stereotype. William is actually, insulting people for believing in this thing, because he says most of the Welsh are considered to be so barbaric that they are said to be still awaiting the future coming of Arthur. Yes, so after the De Gestis began to circulate, the title of the Mab Darogan was only ever attached clearly to two historical men. So even though it's a known figure, it wasn't actually attached to real people very often. So these two figures who it was attached to was Owain Glyndwr, who rebelled against English rule in Wales from the year 1400 to 1415, and Henry Tudor himself. But in the case of Owain Glyndwr, however, Owain did not present himself as the Mab Darogan. He didn't encourage this in his lifetime. Rather, the title was given to him by others, and only long after his death. By contrast, the political prophecy and the title of Mab Darogan was, in a way, essentially encouraged by the Lancastrian faction in the War of the Roses. So the Welsh poet, Dafydd na Mor, was the first to hail Henry as a potential successor to the throne of England, just after his birth. He doesn't stretch to call him a Mab Darogan specifically, but in 1458, he composed a poem which called him a Ciw I'r, or the eagle's chick, when Henry was just a baby, so he'd just been born at this point. So this image, specifically of the eagle's chick, was a common trope used in Welsh prophetic poetry, But as Helen Fulton notes, this image was first of all used by Geoffrey of Monmouth in the Prophecies of Merlin to describe the sort of redeeming leader of the Britons. And then we can see more clearly later on in life, when Henry was old enough to become a stronger contender for the throne, that prophetic poetry becomes much more clear about ambitions for him to take the throne. So there's a lot of examples, and there's a lot of poetry that I couldn't access, unfortunately, because of library restrictions, but I've got one example here, which declares this is the time for a deliverance, the time for a little bull, so that's Henry, to venture forth. There's a longing for Harry, there is hope for a nation. So it's very clear the sort of ambitions and the genre within which this poet is working in. So finally, I have to thank Felicity for these examples. Actually, I didn't know them and they're very, very exciting, but Henry Tudor demonstrates that he was well aware of these kind of claims being made about him, and he used them to his advantage. So Henry actually named his firstborn son Arthur, in full knowledge of all the connotations of that. And there's also rumors that circulate that he was originally called Owain, which is the traditional name given to this redeeming figure in Welsh prophetic poetry. I haven't really been able to chase up that reference properly, but that's an interesting one. And then Henry also sent his wife Elizabeth to Winchester Castle whenever she was about to give birth, because he wanted his son to be born in the castle that housed what they thought was the actual round table of the Arthurian knights. So all of this kind of exemplifies that poets and writers with an eye to the political could very well co-opt the afterlife and the language of the De Gestis for their own purposes. However, its use in this way marked a very important watershed in the history of Geoffrey's text. So referencing it in such important political circumstances did, in a way, raise the metaphorical stakes over whether it was actually true or not. Overall, by Henry Tudor's time, the relative age of Geoffrey's work had only furthered its historical acceptance. The sheer volume of romances and other spin-offs helped solidify its canonical status, as did the literal landscape of England. So, for example, at Glastonbury Abbey, you could actually apparently visit the real tomb of Arthur and Guinevere after it had been excavated. So it was still around in the time of Henry Tudor. So because of this peak in its relevance and importance, it's no surprise that Henry VII maintained an interest in the De Gestis throughout his reign. However, ironically, it was this interest which ended up sparking the harshest criticism of Geoffrey's work to date. So it all started when Henry ordered an Italian intellectual, Polydore Virgil, to research and write a new history of England at the beginning of the 16th century. This work was then published as the Anglica Historia in 1534, although it probably been finished as early as 1512-13. Perhaps because Polydore had not grown up in England and had very little emotional attachment to Geoffrey's work, he did not feel like he had to defend its questionable narrative to the death. Instead, the Anglica Historia tore apart the De Gestis and concluded that it was almost wholly made up, which, remember, it was. He also totally denounced the tomb at Glastonbury and lots of other stuff attached to the De Gestis. And ironically, Henry VII didn't even live to see the publication of the Historia Anglica, and the fallout of its conclusions sort of fell mostly in Henry VIII's reign. So I'm just looking at the time where I'm a little bit over, but Polydore wasn't the exact end of the use. It didn't stop people from using the De Gestis historically. So there's another chronicler, a Welsh chronicler in Henry VIII's reign, Ellis Griffith, who uses it in his own chronicle well after Polydore published that. So it's more opened up a huge debate, which, as we heard earlier, John Priest was a very vehement defender of Geoffrey's narrative. So it sparked a whole series of intellectual debate and other discussions about it. So, but it still had a big impact. So by the time of Elizabeth's reign, the historiographical landscape in England had been really shaken up. Staunch supporters of Geoffrey's version of events still remain vigilant even by her time. So for example, the intellectual John Dee, who was also very proud of his Welsh heritage, staunchly defended the historical validity of the De Gestis. But this atmosphere of fierce debate still ensured that Geoffrey's work remained a vital touchstone for Elizabethan writers and poets. So to finish, I will very quickly look at one example during Elizabeth's reign of this kind of complex atmosphere. So Edmund Spenser, who you hopefully have heard of, wrote The Faerie Queene, which was the first 3 books were published in 1590, and then the next 3 books in 1596. But in the Faerie Queene, sort of the debates about the historical validity of the narrative really seem to seep through. So in this section, this is the opening of book 2, which kind of summarizes the De Gestis. It has a catalogue of the kings that appear in it, and it sort of summarizes it in this form. But the reader is told, directed to look at empirical evidence, which they can well witness yet unto this day, in order to validate the Galfridian narrative. So it's telling the reader, I think, here to look at various hills and stuff which are evidence of fights with giants, which are a big part of the first part of the De Gestis. Brutus and his men fight giants which are inhabiting Britain. But moreover, Brutus's story is turned directly to the important issues of Elizabeth's day. So in this slide, he's also presented as a literal empire builder, that he spread his empire to the utmost shore. And then in this example, he's presented as having an imperial state. So that's in the second line from the bottom there. And this is a generous interpretation of the control Brutus is said to have in the De Gestis. He rules parts of France and conquers bits of them throughout his reign. But it's also really clever in making it relevant to the empire building aspirations of the time. And it also hints to the motif of translatio imperi, or the movement of power. So this is the idea that the power of Rome never really went away, but other countries inherited it. And of course, they argued and competed over who was the true Roman successor. So Brutus was key to England's claim to be this heir of Rome. However, even though this section is presented as a kind of catalogue of Britain's early kings, we have to keep in mind one crucial fact. Spenser is not writing a history, but an epic poem, one in which is particularly self-conscious and clearly allegorical. Throughout it, Spenser claims to be telling stories of a fairyland, which is fully removed from reality. He tells a series of tales with various moral lessons. So, for example, the first book tells the story of St. George and how his over-eagerness to do good sometimes blinds him towards the truth or the consequences of his actions. Yet the very point of the Faerie Queene is to present stories which are morally enriching and worthwhile to tell, because they take time and effort to unravel and understand. So the afterlife of Geoffrey's work fits really snugly into this model of reading. Even Polydore Virgil himself allowed that there were small kernels of truth in Geoffrey's text, so he still accepted the fact, for example, that Arthur was a real king. He just didn't believe a lot of what Geoffrey said about him. So in this way, by pushing the narrative of the De Gestis so clearly in the Faerie Queene, Spenser carefully balances the tensions surrounding its truthfulness. He presents the Galfridian version of events in a specific context to allow the audience to make up their own mind about how much stock they put into them. And this is especially important because the poem is addressed to the Faerie Queene herself, which is obviously Elizabeth I. So from the beginning, there's a weird blending of fact and fiction. On this sweeping tour of the afterlife of Geoffrey's text, I hope I've demonstrated the complex and multifaceted approaches medieval and early modern readers could have towards Geoffrey's work. There was a constant tension over the work's historical validity, but as we've seen, to a large extent, this question of historical accuracy didn't actually matter that much. What was of far greater import was the ways in which Geoffrey's text could be adapted, translated, and transformed in engaging ways for new audiences. And this flexibility ensured not just its survival, but its flourishing into Elizabeth's day. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jenyth. Could you perhaps leave the
Yes.
PowerPoint presentation?
Yes, I can try do that. Yep, there we go. That's it.
Thank you so much. Thank you very, very much for this really fascinating talk. I suggest we immediately move on to our second speaker of this afternoon, and we can take the questions afterwards. Second speaker is Felicity Brown, who is in the third year of her DPhil in English at Jesus College. And her research is on the adaptation and the reception of Arthurian romance in early modern drama. And she's supervised by Professor Laura Ash and Professor Paulina Kieres. The title of her paper today is Performing Geoffrey's King Arthur for Queen Elizabeth I. Felicity, the floor is yours.
I'm just going to try and share my screen as well. Sorry, that doesn't seem to have worked. Can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes, Felicity,
Yes,
we can. We just need to see the presentation side. Yeah.
Okay, how about that?
Perfect. Thank you.
Great, sorry about that. Thank you. So the most important evidence for the performance of Geoffrey of Monmouth's Digestus Britannum in early modern England has been lost. The 5 Arthurian play titles are recorded in the theatrical entrepreneur Philip Henslow's diary. 3 of them, Vortigern, Uther, and The Life and Death of Arthur, King of Britain, are suggestively, enticingly Galfridian, by which I mean Geoffrey-esque of Geoffrey, but none of the plays actually survive. It's been suggested that they might have been staged as a trilogy at the Rose, a kind of rival set of performances to Shakespeare's Henry IV and Henry V plays, but I doubt that we'll ever know for sure. This loss, an accident of fate, along of course with the emphasis bardolatry placed on the commercial theatre and history of artificial periodization in scholarship, has led to a critical misconception that the legend of King Arthur, the urtext of which was Geoffrey's Digestus, was not a significant dramatic subject in Elizabethan England. To challenge this critical narrative, I will briefly consider 2 examples of performances that draw on Geoffrey's work that were both witnessed by Elizabeth I. The first, The Misfortunes of Arthur, was a play written and staged by a group of lawyers and performed for Elizabeth at Greenwich in the Christmas season of 1587 and 1588. Derided or neglected by scholars, this play's only real source of critical interest has been its supposed allusions to the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. I will address the ways in which the play reimagines Geoffrey's narrative of Arthur's fall as a cultural triumph for the British. I'll then turn to the Pendragon Knight performances of George Clifford, the 3rd Earl of Cumberland, otherwise known as the privateering or the pirate Earl, which took place at the Tilt Yards at Whitehall and Windsor in 1591 and 1593, respectively. So before tournament jousting began at these events, each knight would perform a short sort of skit, and Cumberland's performances have tended to be overlooked by scholars in favour of more glamorous jousting characters like Sir Henry Lee or Robert Devereux, the 2nd Earl of Essex. But it's in Cumberland's shows that Geoffrey's account of the prophecies of Merlin are brought to bear on England's conflict with Spain. First, however, I want to ask what it was that appealed about Geoffrey's Digestus to writers in the 16th century. Geoffrey of Monmouth is preoccupied, as Jen has shown us, in Digestus from the first settlement of Britain by Brutus of Troy, a descendant of Aeneas, to the overthrow of British lordship by the Saxons at its end, with the dynamics of colonization and of conquest. Nowhere is this more apparent than in his account of the reign of King Arthur, by far the longest and most detailed reign that he includes. Geoffrey's King Arthur unites Britain and he conquers Rome. In Digestis, the Romans' haughty insistence that Britain pay its long overdue tribute is met with swift military response from Arthur, who mobilizes his realm for war, heads to the continent, and ultimately wins a decisive defeat against the Romans. If you, like the Italian humanist scholar Polydore Virgil that Jen mentioned, think this sounds historically dubious, then we can be grateful that a number of Virgil's 16th century respondents, like the antiquarian John Leyland, aren't here to accuse you of being yet another foreigner just jealous of England's extraordinary military past. Geoffrey's King Arthur, who is both a unifying force and an index of expansionist power, was a particularly poignant figure for his initial 12th century Anglo-Norman audiences. This post-conquest crowd had its own interest, as you can imagine, in territorial expansion, while also having experience of a country riven by civil dissension, as England was in the years between 1136 and 38, when we think Digestis was composed. That said, Geoffrey's English audiences do seem to have regarded this conquering Arthur with largely admiring eyes, right up to the last great medieval Arthurian text, Thomas Mallory's Morte d'Arthur, which was published in 1485, so the year that Henry Tudor claimed the English throne. Geoffrey's account of Arthur's Roman campaign continues to be included. Despite the eventual fall of Geoffrey's Arthur at the hands of his nephew Mordred, he long remained a vital repository of English imperialist ambition. While King Arthur is the outstanding king in Digestis, without a doubt, and his story takes up about a third of the narrative, he is also just one in a long series of insular rulers discussed by Geoffrey, and his conquest can be understood as part of a long tradition of the prerogative of strong British monarchs. As Arthur puts it That's right. Yes, as Arthur puts it, I believe that the Romans should now pay tribute to me, since my ancestors captured Rome in ancient times. The most noble Belli captured Rome and hanged 20 noble Romans in the middle of the Forum. He held the city for many years. And let us not forget Constantine, the son of Helen, or Maximianus, both my near kinsmen, both kings of Britain, who also ascended to the throne of the Roman Empire. Critical understandings of Geoffrey's precise political message have been diverse, with views that range from seeing him as a ruthless apologist for Anglo-Norman hegemony in Wales, to readings that present him as the proponent of Welsh proto-nationalism, or even a post-colonial subaltern kind of speaking back to empire. Geoffrey himself, in what is certainly my favourite of the Digestis controversies, defers questions about the ultimate meaning of his text to his putative source, also mentioned by Jen just now, that certain very ancient book in the British tongue. Whether or not his elusive source was material or imagined, it is clear that Geoffrey's most consistent interest lies in the theme of translatio imperii, the passage of dominion or of power. And it was this theme that appealed to the writers of the 16th century's only extant Arthurian play, The Misfortunes of Arthur. So The Misfortunes of Arthur is an adaptation in 5 acts of Geoffrey's account of Arthur's last battle and his death, or his passing. It is a collaborative play composed by 8 gentlemen of Gray's Inn, one of the early modern inns of court, which were cultural and political centres in early modern London, as well as legal training grounds for aspirant young men. Francis Bacon was actually one of the collaborators, though the majority of The Misfortunes was written by Thomas Hughes. Hughes took the plot from Digestis, where Arthur, having defeated the Saxons and united Britain, left Mordred in charge of Britain while he makes war on the continent. The war, makes war on the continent in the war, which culminates with his conquest of Rome. Mordred, however, seizes the opportunity provided by Arthur's absence to take both the throne and Arthur's wife, Guinevere. Arthur hears of his betrayal and returns, and then civil war ensues. The first line of the play's prologue, a dispute between the Muses and a group of law students, promises that the play will be, a la Geoffrey, of conquest, the signs and fruits, and it quickly delivers. The first character to appear, however, is the vengeful ghost of Duke Gaulois, and he describes how Arthur's navies homeward float, triumphantly bedecked with Roman spoils. Gaulois' ghost is an interesting adaptation of Geoffrey's character, Duke Gaulois of Cornwall, the husband of Arthur's mother, who is killed by Arthur's father. In Digestis, Gaulois never reappears after death, but Hughes resuscitates him and brings him back as a shade. So why introduce a ghost into the tragedy enacting the fall of Britain's greatest king? Well, as early as Lucretius, Quintilian, and Virgil, ghosts were figures of literary imitation. So they represented, or they could be used to represent, the presence of an earlier text or an influence. Virgil, for example, uses a ghost more than once to cite the influence of Homer. In this period, however, and particularly in the early modern Inns of Court literary tradition, ghosts not only signify the influence of a source text, but specifically its translation. So you have my little translation ghost there. The fact that the play begins with the ghost of a character from Geoffrey alerts us to the importance of translatio, from the Latin transferre, so carrying across, in a play in which almost half of the lines comprise Hughes's original translations from classical texts. So you can literally go through and spot in this play all the different lines taken from classical authors. Arthur's conquests are thus repeatedly used in this play to explore the triumph of English vernacular. In this way, Arthur's conquests are linked with Hughes's process as a poet and a playwright. Decked with so many spoils of conquered kings, to thee hath long renowned Rome at last held up her hands, bereft of former pomp. Both Arthur and Hughes translate Latin spoils into England, or rather into English, in this vision of national authorial triumph. To put it another way, London is the new Rome and English the new Latin. I'm not alone in noticing the centrality of translations to misfortunes, though the earliest extant review of the play was not enthused by Hughes's approach. Blush, Seneca, to see thy feathers loose, plucked from a swan and sticked on a goose. This withering critique, discovered in the papers of Anthony Bacon, the brother of the play's best-known lawyer collaborator, reveals that the prominence of the play's use of translation was apparent to contemporaries. In fact, every single one of the 10 plays believed at the time to comprise Seneca's tragic oeuvre provided lines that Hughes translated directly into the play, as well as, of course, many lines from works by Lucan and Virgil. In this way, Hughes elevates his subject, previously the topic of a slightly suspect medieval author, by imbuing it with lines from the classics that the humanist educative programme had both disseminated and Englished. To quote Gaulois' Ghost, the wealth of foremost world can make a golden age again. So the classic texts in question had all been translated into English before the misfortunes of Arthur, many times in fact, not least by other members of the Inns of Court. But never before had they been simultaneously translated together and into Britain's greatest legend, performed then for the Queen of England herself. Misfortunes thus uses Digestus to yoke the idea that Jen introduced us to of translatio imperi, so the historiographical concept in which history is viewed as a linear succession of transfers of power, to the idea of translatio studii, when that same process happens, but what's being transferred is kind of knowledge and learning. The wisdom of the ancients is appropriated for Geoffrey's superlative king in this play, and Arthur acquires all the cultural cachet of the classics. The conquests of Geoffrey's Arthur are thus reimagined in Misfortunes. The Elizabethan era's least popular play was never reperformed as a literary victory. Where the Misfortunes adapts Geoffrey's imperialism to inspire Elizabethan gentlemen to help make England great again by taking up their pens, George Clifford, 3rd Earl of Cumberland, brings Digestus Britonum onto the Elizabethan tournament circuit to very different ends. If you're interested in kind of Elizabethan art, he is one of the most wonderful subjects of lots of surviving portraits. That miniature on the slide is from the National Maritime Museum, I think. Yes, so I'll return. Yes, so he, unlike Hughes and his collaborators, Cumberland did not turn to Geoffrey's story of Arthur's fall for his inspiration. Instead, he used the Geoffrey's account of Merlin's prophecies. And I'll return to Geoffrey's prophetic Merlini in a minute, but first a word on the accession day tournaments. These events were first staged in the 1570s under the aegis of the Queen's self-appointed champion, Sir Henry Lee, and this was part of the defiant response to the Catholic threat epitomised by the Northern Rebellion of 1569 and the bull of excommunication issued by Pope Pius V in 1570. These festivities, of which the tournament formed only one part, Accession Day also comprised prayers and sermons, bell ringing, bonfires and feasting. But yes, all of these events were both kind of courtly and popular events. The central feature of the day, however, open to the public for a small charge, was a tournament in which the Queen's courtiers competed with one another in the tilt yard at the palace, usually of Whitehall, unless it was a plague year, both in the jousts and in the fictions they created and performed before and after the jousting. While the chivalric ideal of aristocratic manhood that tournaments expressed was still important in the second half of the 16th century, tilts no longer functioned as training for war. And because Elizabeth couldn't join in, every 17th of November, she adopted the position of observer, patron, and judge. And so the performances, their pavilions, costumes, and conceits all got more and more elaborate as attention was focused out from the tournament onto the spectator, the Queen. And it was the Earl of Cumberland, one of the period's most colourful courtiers, famed for his exotic voyages and extravagant debts, who, after succeeding to Leeds' nominal position of Queen's champion in 1590, adapted Geoffrey's prophecies for his performances at the Accession Day tournaments of 91 and 93. And just a word more about that picture, that is to commemorate his accession to this slightly made up position, Queen's champion. So that's from 1590, the year before I'm talking about. And actually, if you look, the same armour that he was wearing in that painting survives. And we have the armour, and it's at the Met. So that's the armour that's on the left there. That is actually not the armour that he wears in the tournaments that I'm talking about. He wears white armour. So to return then to the prophecies, Geoffrey's account of Merlin's prophecies have a significant bearing on our understanding of Geoffrey's colonial preoccupations, because they stand as a metatext commenting on the unfolding of British history in Digestis. The Prophetiae Melini originally circulated independently of Digestis in the early 12th century, before being integrated into his larger history. As it stands, Geoffrey's rendition of the prophecies of the boy prophet Merlin to King Vortigern function as a pivot point at the centre of his narrative, providing a symbolic counterpoint to the introduction of the Saxons, who figure both as the villainous allies of Vortigern and as a foreign people who threaten to precipitate a new movement of translatio imperii upon Britain. It has been contended that Geoffrey introduced political prophecy to England. Whether or not that's the case, there is no doubt that Digestis was vitally important in enhancing the popularity of political prophecy and establishing its conventions. Where European Sibyllic prophecy used, for example, letters or anagrams to evoke particular people, Geoffrey's prophecies are distinguished by their use of animals, birds, and heraldic symbols. Cumberland's tilt performances not only summarise the most famous of Geoffrey's prophecies, the Omen of the Dragons, but introduce two more in their style, which present contemporary conflicts as latter-day versions of King Arthur's battles on the continent. Geoffrey's Merlin is made here the prophet of privateering. In his 1591 performance, Cumberland appeared on the tilt yard at Whitehall as the Pendragon Knight, with a portable pavilion set of the ruined castle, Pendragon Castle, which was part of the Cumberland estates in the north, and a page dressed as Merlin. So the document on the far right there is the only extant copy of this particular performance. And I'm sorry that picture hasn't turned out very well, but that's an image from a copy of Digestis of the Omen of the Dragons. Cumberland's Merlin tells the crowd how, as in Geoffrey, the tower that Vortigern had been attempting to build keeps collapsing because two dragons, one red and one white, battle beneath it every night. In Geoffrey, it is explained that the red dragon represents the Britons and the white, the Saxons. In Cumberland's show, there are different developments. Bringing his summary of Vortigern's dragon to an end, he then shares his own prophecies. Cumberland's Merlin predicts that when Castor and Pollux on the land appears, and the red dragon shall seem like snow, then shall ye cormorant, that now the eagle height, have his feathers molten by a virgin's might. The virgin was, of course, Elizabeth, and the red dragon was a Tudor icon promoted by Henry VII and used after his victory at the Battle of Bosworth to symbolise his ancestral link to Cadwallader, Geoffrey's last ancient British king, who Jen mentioned as well. And it was maintained by Elizabeth. But it was also the familial crest, of Cumberland's family and the name of one of his ships. Sadly, Cumberland's white suit of armour does not survive, but we know from other sources, including George Peele's poem Polyhymnia, that he owned a white suit of armour, and this is what I think he was wearing at this particular event. So that makes him the red dragon that seems like snow. By casting himself as the Red Dragon in this way, Cumberland aligns his interests not only with Arthur and the romance of the ancient Britons, but with Elizabeth and the English nations. The bird referred to here, unlike the bird image for Henry VII that we just heard about, is actually a reference to to Philip II's heraldic eagle of St. John. Elsewhere in this performance, it's called the Black Eagle. So as war with Spain was beginning in 1586, Cumberland had begun his career as a privateer, as much to recoup some of his gambling losses as for patriotic duty or the desire for maritime glory. But he really took to it. In his first biography, which is written by his daughter, she says that it was his love of mathematics when he was studying at Trinity College, Cambridge, that led him to his passion for navigation and seafaring. And anyway, after 86, which was the first year that he engaged in a privateering venture, he then did so with almost annual regularity for the rest of his life, but with limited financial success. In fact, he had very, very bad luck. And he either went as a commander or he kind of funded it and organized the ventures as a promoter, but didn't necessarily go on all of them. He did distinguish himself in his service of the Armada campaign in 1588, as well as on repeated trips to the Azores. In 1592, a year when there was no tournament because of the plague, Cumberland was actually associated with the greatest prize of the privateering war, the capture of the Madre de Dios. Having been called ashore, however, and so not actually sailed with the fleet that captured the ship. This cost Cumberland dearly, as the terms of his patent ensured him the substantial share of the profit, only if he commanded in person. So a dispute that was both tense and embarrassing then ensued between Cumberland and the Crown as he tried to recoup some of the winnings from Elizabeth, who was, as you can imagine, reluctant to part with them. It is these initiatives that Merlin alludes to when he elaborates that oftentimes with great courage and with no looked for success, hath the dragon pulled some feathers, but not seized on the body of this displayed eagle. As well as the literal suggestion of the pride of the Spanish at sea, the use of displayed here further hints at the key to interpreting Galfredian prophecy, because displayed is a heraldic term for a bird shown affronte, with its head turned to dexter and its wings spread, which is, of course, the attitude of Philip's heraldic eagle. Unlike some of Geoffrey's more obscure passages in the Prophetiae Merlini, and they are obscure, this prophetic language used here in these performances is supposed not to obscure, but to invite interpretation. It's made very clear who's who. It's with reference to Castor and Pollux that Cumberland introduces his favourite theme, his service at sea. Consistently associated with horses and depicted as helmeted horsemen carrying spears, got a picture of them there. The Dioscuri offer a classical demigod image of the knights jousting at the Accession Day tournament. The myth of their partnership, death, and immortality might also be understood as a compliment to Cumberland's predecessor, Lee, as he and Sir Henry Lee had tilted as a pair more than once. Most significantly, however, of course, as Argonauts, the mythical twins were the kind of classical protectors of sailors. And the image of sailors appearing on land, like the Red Dragon, alludes to Cumberland's privateering career. On his, sorry, there's a picture there. It's an Italian picture, I think, of the Dioscuri at sea. So they're both famous horsemen and the protectors of those who sail. Adventures, yes, so Merlin had already informed the audience that the Earl's crosses have been many, and for them he has received, Merlin says, neither loyalty, regard, nor for his labour profit. Elizabeth is then likened by Merlin to the Gemini, and so elevated up to the stars, from where she can protect her loyal subjects at sea. Ideally, the speech suggests that support will be financial as well as just symbolic. Cumberland introduces his seafaring activities subtly here, but it was a theme he would expand on more explicitly when reprising the role of the Pendragon Knight in 1593, appearing not just with Merlin on this second occasion, but with mariners. While using King Arthur to evoke patriotic feeling and inspire military action was by no means new in the 1590s, the particular association made by Cumberland's tilt-yard performances between Geoffrey's Arthur and maritime warfare is less conventional. The Arthurian legend is, of course, populated with ships, a number of boats associated with King Arthur and the legend. For example, the boat on which Arthur claims Excalibur from the lake, so there's a picture of that there. The ships of the Grail, the boat that carries Elaine of Astolat to her death, which is the background, and the boat of Queens that takes the dying Arthur to Avalon are almost as iconic as the Round Table. The emphasis in these episodes, however, is never on sailors or the skill required to sail a ship or ships fighting each other at sea. Arthur does travel by sea in Digestus and other medieval texts, but that travel or its role in warfare is almost never emphasized. There's one exception to this, which is the first vernacular translation of Geoffrey, Wace's French vernacular Roman de Brut, which I think there's some beautiful passages about seafaring there, and I think that may be a response to the White Ship disaster of 1120, but that's another story. So this disinterest in seafaring everywhere except Wace is true of other contemporary accounts of Arthur by sort of Cumberland's peers and friends, despite the fact that to justify their own colonial enterprise, they claim that Arthur's conquest has extended to places as far-flung as the North Pole and the New World. I'm thinking particularly here of John Dee, so Queen Elizabeth's kind of magus. So yes, Cumberland's tilt speech is thus original in imagining so prominent a place for seamen or mariners in Geoffrey's legacy. Cumberland's second Arthurian tilt explains that because all his sailors were so eager to meet the Queen, he's invited some of them along to join the show. Presenting them as knightly companions, Cumberland's performance elevates their profession. The early modern maritime community, while diverse in some ways, was also distinct. Free from the restrictions and regulations of other trade groups controlled by guilds, sailors lacked the protection that the guild offered. They rendered seamen both unusually free. Each man decided such critical factors as how long he spent at land and on sea, which was a freedom that sailors in the period cherished. But at the same time, this made them particularly vulnerable to the Crown's interference during kind of war years. Cumberland recasts this kind of this as a kind of marginal chivalric identity. So he parallels the errant knight with the lonely sailor. The sailors do also, of course, provide a convenient cover, as it's on their behalf this time, not just his own, that Cumberland once again petitions Queen Elizabeth for adequate recompense for work as dangerous and daring as privateering. In this second performance, Merlin prophesies that when the Red Dragon has led shipmen on dry land, blessed be the earth for a maid in an island. Here, the historicity of Geoffrey's account is less important than Arthur's role as a military inspiration. This is achieved by echoing Geoffrey's preoccupation with the ways in which prophecy can make history meaningful in the present. Merlin's prophetic legacy allows him to bridge the gap between the legendary Arthurian past and the Elizabethan present, while figures like Arthur and his knights are only remembered, not staged. So it's a kind of new age of new heroes, like Cumberland. Merlin's presence and his prophecies are used by Cumberland to cast himself as the heir to the militarism of the imperial Arthur and his warrior knights in Digestus. The herald William Seagar, an enthusiastic documenter of all sort of things tilting, moves from his account of these accession day tilts in his book Honour, Military and Civil, to describing analogues between the wonderful deeds of Arthur's knights and the recent voyages of Sir Francis Drake, Sir Martin Frobisher, and others. Geoffrey's Arthur and his knights thus become the ancestors of contemporary naval heroes, whose endeavours on the high seas in the New World can be understood and made popular with reference to the adventures of Arthurian romance. That said, in the next record that we have of Cumberland at a tilt performing, we have records of him tilting elsewhere, but not the record of his sort of show at the beginning. But our next record of his show is from 1600, and this time he no longer appears as the hopeful, heroic Pendragon knight. In 1600, he appears as the melancholy knight in his black armour, overshadowed by others despite his greater worth, devoting himself to a life of debt and darkness. In conclusion then, the variety of responses to Geoffrey's project bear witness to his pseudo-history's success at not overcommitting itself to any particular political position. It also demonstrates the lasting appeal of Geoffrey's preoccupation with colonization and conquest's vital role in the warp and weft of any account of the past, even a largely fictitious one. Though, as I hope I've demonstrated, the ways in which this was used in Elizabeth's reign varied considerably, Geoffrey's interest in different types of conquest does persist in all the early modern dramatic adaptations of De Gestis Britonum. Particularly, I think this is something that comes out in the drama. Performances are, after all, always polyvocal sites, dialogues in which different voices compete and coexist, and where authority is rendered ambiguous, even as it is kind of affirmed. Sadly, what Queen Elizabeth herself made of these adaptations of Geoffrey's Arthur, her alleged ancestor, is yet another important piece of evidence that, for now at least, like the commercial Arthurian plays of the period, remains lost. Thank you. My last slide there is just Arthur in a tapestry, Elizabeth and Geoffrey in the middle.
Thank you so much, Felicity, for this wonderful lecture. We have quite a few reactions in the chat.
Sure. May I just jump in quickly to say to both of our speakers, especially just having to work and persevere as students during the pandemic. Just to say that, your research, and hopefully, everyone on the call today shares this view that, your research is important, just keep going. I know it hasn't been the ideal student experience at Jesus and at Oxford over the last year, but we've all been very grateful for your talk today, and we just, your research is wonderful, and we're supporting you, and thank you so much for sharing today.
I fully concur. Thank you very much, Brittany, and thank you very much, both our speakers. I'll just give you a brief overview of what's been going on in the chat during your talks. It's been very lively, actually. Ian Thomas says, Arthurian legend is alive and well in Wales. In my hometown, Carmarthen, you will find Merlin's Hill and Merlin's Oak, on whose survival the survival of the very town depends. When Merlin's Oak shall tumble down, then shall fall Carmarthen town. In 1978, the last fragments were taken to Carmarthenshire County Museum, and sure enough, shortly after, Carmarthen suffered its worst floods in living memory. And Angela Jackson confirms that Arthurian legend is alive and well also in Cumbria at King Arthur's Mount near Emont Bridge. And John Wilson says he got around. Arthur's seat in Edinburgh, Cadair Idris in West Wales, several footprints. What a chap.
I love all of those. Yeah, just to jump in, like those place sort of stories and all of that stuff is fantastic. And then I didn't get time to cover it in my talk, but there's such a big part of Ellis Griffith's Chronicle, and he incorporates a lot of local stories. I know David Willis is in the chat, and we've had classes on Ellis Griffith for the past 2 terms, so of course he knows all about this, but Ellis incorporates loads of stories like that about from his hometown of Flintshire into his own history of Arthur. So it's very much part of the tradition, passing on all of these stories. So.
Fantastic. Ian also had a question. Are there any other European examples of legendary leaders who have fallen asleep and whose return is expected to restore the nation to its former glory? And Clive Jenkins jumped in and said Barbarossa, but perhaps you think of other.
I can think of others, but I don't want to be pushed on it because I can't back up where I've got this from. But I'm sure that Jen, you might know more about this, but isn't there a kind of folkloric tradition about the sleeping king, or the king who sleeps in the mountain? And I think that as well as Arthur, I think Charlemagne is another possibly sleeping king. I don't know if he's coming back to save his nation. But I think that there's a biblical king as well who sleeps. It might be David, who's part of the kind of mountain king thing. That's all I could think of for that.
No, I mean, I was going to defer to you because I really don't, I couldn't think of any examples. I'm not too hot on the sort of wider European folklore, but Charlemagne, I think you're definitely right. There's definitely a whole tradition there about him returning. The only thing I could think of was there's a few figures in medieval Irish tales. They don't really fall asleep, but they're definitely resurrected and brought back at various points, but not as a redeeming figure. So St. Patrick raises a few important figures from Irish stories like Cuchulainn and has a chat with them, which is really funny, and then sort of weirdly baptizes them in the Christian faith and saves them from their pagan history. So it's a really weird, but that's entirely different from the redeeming thing. I mean, the only other thing to say about it is that it's quite obviously messianic, so it's like very influenced by the idea of Jesus coming back and redeeming people from their sins and that sort of thing. So it's very much in that vein. But yeah, I hadn't heard of Barbarossa. Actually, that's a really good point, and I completely forgot about Charlemagne. So
it made me think also of what you just said about some of those Irish figures not being necessarily like redemptive or much awaited. There's obviously, it made me think of the Edward I goes to Glastonbury and kind of opens Arthur's grave again, and it seems to be sort of a political gesture, just to make very sure that everyone, particularly the Welsh, know he is dead, like he's not coming back, which I always think is quite a kind of just quite an interesting kind of political moment.
Thank you very much. There is a question from Ruth, specifically for Jenyth. She asks, how did you come across this topic and become interested in it?
Oh yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, it's a bit of a, I'll try and keep it short, but basically I originally did classics for my undergrad, so I did mainly like Greek and Roman history. But then you might not be able to tell from my accent, but I'm actually Northern Irish. I sound very English now, but I'm from a Protestant background, so I never had the opportunity to learn Irish at school or in that sort of culture. So, but there was an opportunity to learn it at university, so I did that. I learned Old Irish, and then that sort of spiraled on to introducing me to Celtic studies as a whole. So specifically the Arthurian stuff, my supervisor just suggested it to me. I was originally just interested in looking at classical stories and their use in Ireland, so mainly Virgil and how it was read in Ireland. But then I went on and read the other texts I'm doing for my dissertation, which is Lever Gvála Éireann, the Book of the Takings of Ireland. And then that's very similar to what Geoffrey does. It's kind of a foundational history written in the 11th century about where the Irish come from, their ancient history and stuff. And my supervisor was like, it's actually very similar to what Geoffrey does. Maybe you should look into that. And here we are. But it's mainly out of wanting to know what my country's history was and then what Welsh history was, and learning the languages of both places. That's really where it stemmed from. So
wonderful. Ian Thomas had or continued on the question of Merlin's oak in Carmarthen. Is it possible that the link was forged because of an underlying theme of restoration? That is, Charles II's restoration inspires a legend harking back or looking forward to the restoration of Arthur.
I mean, I don't know the answer to that, but that does sound right to me. Is something that I'm going to go and check up now, because that's exactly when these, particularly the Arthurian myth, seems to kind of resurface. But I'm quite bad if you go beyond 1603.
I mean, I'm pretty much the same as I've said to Felicity. Moving into the early modern period is a very new thing for me. I was very much classical and then medieval, so this is the latest chronological step for me. So I'm not quite sure about the Charles II restoration stuff, but again, like as Felicity shown in her talk and as I talked about it a bit, these things are adapted and changed with their times and put into new circumstances. So yeah, that sounds like an excellent idea. Definitely something to look into.
And there was a question from Andrew Dunning, who spoke this morning. He says, or he asks, how do you think the Latin language of Geoffrey's book affected its reception in your periods? More generally, and perhaps beyond the scope of these talks, do Welsh speakers see Latin as a more neutral language than English?
I might get in quickly before Jen gives a really
Please
good answer, because definitely is the classicist in the group. But just from staying very, very focused on the tiny area that I know a little bit about, I feel like it definitely is significant in the Inns of Court crowd that I was discussing, and I think that's why Hughes and co adapt their Arthurian story from Arthur, when for various other reasons it would probably have made more sense to use Mallory. But I think that it's their obsession with kind of Latin writing and classical culture that makes Geoffrey a more legitimate plot to adapt, rather than Mallory's kind of vernacular one.
Yeah, this is such an excellent question. It's a really, really important one. And yeah, I think the comparison with English, I think it definitely helps the translation of the De Gestis into Welsh, having it in Latin, because the kind of people who would be producing the copies of texts in these monasteries, you would have to be fluent in Latin to be able to work in those contexts in the first place. You'd have to be able to read commentaries in the Bible. You'd have to read the Vulgate Latin version of the Bible. So in that sense, it really made it accessible to those kind of people. It's quite difficult, the question of English. That's really something I should have read more about, but I haven't. But I have a feeling that, knowing English wouldn't have been, an impossible thing for someone working in a Welsh monastery. It really depends whereabouts you're in Wales, because in Geoffrey's time, most of Wales has sort of been co-opted by those marcher lords that I was talking about. So most of Wales was under those people's control. So English and French would have been important languages to have to interact with that kind of infrastructure. But North Wales, parts of it definitely were not under Anglo-Norman control. So again, it's a really great question. I wish I knew more about the language sort of situation. But again, it's another important thing, because Geoffrey claimed to originally translate it from the ancient British language, which was assumed to be Welsh. So it's interesting that that the translations, they produce their own modern Welsh translations, and Geoffrey was never asked to produce this original copy. That's one of the biggest mysteries about all of this. But
fantastic. Gabriel Schenk wanted to know how popular Geoffrey's Prophetiae Melini was in comparison to his De Gestis Britonum.
I suppose by the time, most of the copies that I've seen that are circulating in the 16th century, they've been, the Prophetiae Melini comes in the middle of De Gestis. So that's quite hard to say. It definitely has a hugely popular tradition, as I tried to show a little bit of. There's lots of imitation Galfredian prophecy going on. My understanding, but I will defer to Jen on this, is that the Prophetiae Melini was originally hugely popular, and perhaps that was why it was included. But I think that's all I've got. Yeah.
No, I think you're right. I have a feeling that the Prophetiae Merlini, I think some people think it circulated separately to the De Gestis Britonum, perhaps even before the De Gestis was written itself. This might not be correct. I have a feeling one historian references the Prophetiae before we get the first mention of the De Gestis. I think it's someone like, I can't remember. It's some Anglo-Norman historian. I wish I knew off the top of my head. But anyway, yeah, they did seem to be quite like very popular as well, and they circulated alongside copies of some of the Sibylline prophecies, and then I want to say some parts of Bede as well. So sometimes as part of a collection, sometimes on their own. But yeah, people were interested in them. Yeah.
And they were so popular, weren't they, that he went on to write the Vitae Melanie.
Of course, yes. Thank you for that. Yeah. So so after both of those, yeah, he wrote his an epic poem about Merlin, which it's really strange because it's much closer to some of the original Welsh material than what he incorporates into the De Gestis. So some people think he might have found maybe another few copies of Taliesin or some other Welsh sources and then incorporated them into the Vita Merlini. But yeah, it seems to have sparked a demand for more Merlin material. Thank you for reminding me of that, Felicity.
Angela Jackson had a question of etymology, maybe for David Willis. The question is, does the legend of Brutus offer an alternative theory for the origin of British Britain via Brittany?
Yeah, so I think if you, Felicity, please feel free to jump in if you know anymore. But I think it's something that I kind of glossed over a bit in my talk. But the book that Geoffrey claims to translate from for the De Gestis, the book in the British language, in the original Latin, this could actually mean Breton as well. It's ambiguous. Britanniae can mean both of those things. It can mean either Welsh or Brittany. So there's a whole question there, and there's just a book that was published last year, I think, that makes a really strong argument that actually when Geoffrey's referring to Welsh sources, he may as well be referring to Breton sources. So it's a really, really interesting, important question, and there's lots of stuff happening with that right now. And of course, at the end of the text, Cadwallader sends his sons to Brittany, so there's an implication there that his power was transferred to that island. So yeah, so that's quite important. But I don't know if I've forgotten anything or you want to add anything, Felicity.
No, you've got it.
There's a few replies in the chat, so that's notably, well, the last one is by David Willis. Yes, the idea that Britain was named after Brutus was around and justified the Geoffrey legend. Fantastic. I had a question which comes from a completely lay perspective, basically, because I'm more into modern literature. But I was fascinated by the fact that Geoffrey fabricated this notion of this being translated from Welsh, and I was just wondering how common this was to present things as a translation in the early days.
So my understanding would be that it's very common, and it's almost the particulars that Geoffrey gives that are less common, and that idea of kind of whether it's real or imagined, providing authority kind of legitimizes your own creative endeavor is sort of characteristic of this period. Jen, is that right?
Yeah, no, I agree, and it's such an interesting question because, again, I didn't really have time to like get into it in the talk itself, but I mean, William of Newburgh is often quoted as the main critic of Geoffrey, and he lived around the time. So he was born in the 1130s, so that was the time that the De Gestis was published, around then. But it's almost weird because it's so blatant that you wonder how, like, whether Geoffrey actually intended to fool people or anything like that, because he says that he got this book from an archdeacon, which is, you know, a pretty popular figure, like a well-known figure, more like, that's a better way of putting it. So someone could chase it up and be like, hey, Walter, did you actually provide this book or not? So and so if it was a massive lie, like it would be able to be chased up like that. But I think it's more that it's almost like, this is my working theory at the moment, but it's almost like a kind of courtly joke that he got this material from Walter and presented it in this way. And William's so angry because he isn't in on it. William is based in Durham, which is hundreds of miles away, and obviously not in these circles, and he's born a bit after it's published. So I think it's more that it's this elaborate, that everyone knows that Geoffrey's using some Welsh material and bringing it into this court, but it's not really meant to be an accurate representation of it. And I don't think that was ever intended, but then the popularity of it turned it into a whole different beast. So, and then, yeah, I hope that kind of answers that.
Yeah, absolutely. There's two more questions. First is from Rhiannon. A question for you both. What are you going to be looking at next in your research on these topics?
I can go. Yeah. So I've just finished actually writing my thesis chapter on tilt performances. Obviously, a little bit of which I shared with you today. My next chapter, which is actually the last chapter of my thesis, is on a masque written by Ben Jonson, and the kind of set is designed by Inigo Jones, but it's kind of the least studied of all Ben Jonson's works. It's called The Speeches at Prince Henry's Barriers. So this was to celebrate Henry Frederick Stuart becoming Prince of Wales, and barriers are kind of, I guess, very similar to a joust or a tilt, but they're on foot. And this was a masque that happened before the barriers took place, so in that sense quite similar to some of the tilt shows. And the central feature is the kind of ruined house of chivalry, and then Henry and his friends kind of emerge, but Arthur appears as a star, the star Arcturus, which is quite fun because it's kind of an echo of the performances that celebrated Prince Arthur, as in Prince Arthur Tudor, Henry VIII's older brother, his wedding to Catherine of Aragon. So they also had Arthur featured as a star in one of the big shows. So there's something quite interesting going on about doomed princes of Wales. It's not very very Geoffrey at this point. The adaptation is very, very free, but it's still an Arthurian kind of performance.
Oh, amazing. So sorry, I'm just really excited to read what you're going to write for this. It sounds so cool. Yeah, so as Dirk introduced, I'm doing my thesis. I'm comparing Geoffrey of Monmouth to an Irish text, which is also kind of about the origin legend of the Irish and where they came from. So I've just written my first chapter, sort of comparing them in their original contexts and how they were quite similar in their sort of methods of production and that sort of thing. But I'll be going on, I think in my next chapter, I'll be looking at Anglo-Norman like adaptations and uses of the Irish Lefrog of Ola whenever they invade Ireland and take over, and how Irish poets respond to that and use Lefrog of Ola in order to understand the Anglo-Norman invasion. And then similar stuff and how Welsh poets and Welsh translations, so like the Briti Brennan responded to sort of more Anglo-Norman infrastructure and stuff in that. And then last chapter will be on early modern stuff, so the Henry Tudor, all of that lovely stuff, Spencer probably, but it's a bit up in the air at this point.
Very cool. I think this will be the last question. It's a question from Clive Jenkins, and he asks, could you please comment on the theory that Geoffrey was a Breton?
Wow. Yeah, I mean, I'd be the best thing for academic reasons about Geoffrey's life is that it's so we know so little, so you can say so much, if that makes sense. So I think a Breton theory is quite very possible. I think Ben Guy is a scholar who's recently argued quite strongly for it, but it's basically arguing that if Geoffrey was a son of a Marcher lord, then it might have been a Breton lord who moved to the Welsh Marches and then had all those connections to Brittany and stuff like that. So Yeah, I think it's fairly possible. The problem is we just have so little actual evidence to say something concrete. It's quite difficult, but yeah.
I don't think I have anything really to add to that on Geoffrey, but it does make me think of one of my other favourite things about the Misfortunes of Arthur play I mentioned is that in the middle, a character called Gildas Potterson, who, as I'm sure you all know, is a kind of 6th century historian of Britain. And he's another figure, isn't he, is quite divisive in terms of his life. Obviously, he goes on to kind of become a saint, but it's very much, yeah, which Breton is he, and everyone gets quite heated debating that. So it seems to be a problem across the medieval period.
Brilliant. And first of all, just to add my own thanks to Jenyth, to Felicity, to fantastic papers this afternoon, and to Alexandra and Andrew for their papers this morning, and to Dirk and David for chairing them so well. As Dirk said, this is the final event in our Celebrating the Welsh College strand, but by no means our final Welsh event ever at college. We will have plenty more coming up, so please don't worry about that. But for this strand, I'd particularly like to thank Mark Williams and Paulina Cavers for all their work in curating this series.